Hi team, welcome back. This time we're going to focus on relative clauses, on defining and non-defining relative clauses. Basically, I suggest that you study yourself My Grammar Lab C1 C2 level. It is Unit 53 after watching this video. And first of all, I suggest that we start with a meme for you to memorize this topic better from the very beginning. So basically, a non-defining relative clause gives some extra information to the sentence. And basically, we can omit a non-defining relative clause with no changes to the main clause, right? To the main sentence. And just from the very beginning, let us start with an example sentence, which is gonna be the natives who traded with the settlers retained land, right? So these are two basically the same sentences as you may see, but with two commas in the second one. So the natives who traded with the settlers retained land. The first one, here, who traded with the settlers is some essential information. This is a qualification of the natives, right? So probably there were natives who traded with the settlers. This is their qualification. And probably there were natives who did not trade with the settlers. And probably these guys didn't manage to retain their land. They lost it, right? At the same time, when we put two commas before who and before retained, we mark that this information is non-essential, right? We can omit this. The natives retained land. We have a complete sentence that makes sense. This way, all the natives retained the land. All of them were trading with the settlers. So this is just an example sentence for you to memorize this topic better. Let us focus on a relative clause. This is basically a clause that gives some extra information about a noun, about the whole sentence, and it usually starts with a relative pronoun, who, which, that, those, whose, whom, sorry. All right, we can also have some three more tools to paraphrase a relative clause, just for you to have different kinds of tools in your speech. This might be a prepositional phrase, people with a complaint, meaning people who have a complaint. A participle clause, the man living downstairs is the man who lives downstairs. And finally, an infinitive clause, like with the purpose. The first person to help me is the first person who helped me, right? So these three tools are also useful while paraphrasing relative clauses. Just some grammar for you to navigate through this topic better. A main clause is just the main sentence, right? So the clause, it's a complete sentence inside the sentence, right? You can see this scheme. A subordinate clause is the one that is dependent on the main clause, right? We can ask a question from one word here to connect to the subordinate clause. We may sometimes put commas between these two clauses. We sometimes do not do this. It will also depend on the sentence. Relative clause is a type of a subordinate clause, right? So a type of a dependent clause on the main one. All right, let us focus on this topic in terms of pronouns. We cannot omit the pronoun when it is the subject of a relative clause, right? Last week I saw that film, which won all the Oscars, right? In the subordinate clause with these brackets, with this type of brackets, we can see that the word which is the subject, is like the doer of the action, which won all the Oscars. So we cannot omit this pronoun here. At the same time, we can omit the pronoun when it is the object of the sentence. To omit means to leave out, just in case you didn't know this word. Last week I saw the film Which You Made at College. We can omit this pronoun and it will be the following way. Last week I saw the film You Made at College, right? So my students do sometimes have doubts, like why is which, whose, whom omitted, and it's basically okay. We can omit this pronouns in relative clauses. Then, to make the sentence clear, to avoid all the unnecessary interpretations, we usually put the relative clause as close as possible to the noun it refers to the noun it depends on. Let us have a look. You can buy this dish which is made from organic wheat from your local supermarket, right? If you have a look at the first sentence, so the supermarket is going to be the main word in the sentence, and which is made from organic wheat is going to be dependent on the word supermarket, right? It's not the meaning that we wanted to put here. So we put the relative clause as close as possible to the noun it refers to. So we focused on relative clauses in general. Let us now focus on defining relative clauses. These are clauses that classify a noun or a pronoun in the main clause, right? It gives qualifications probably to a pronoun or a noun. Let us have a look. Is this the book that you were looking for? Right, so that you were looking for is the qualification of the book. Would all those who have booked the dinner please go into the restaurant, right? Not all the people in general, but only those who have booked the dinner. This is their key qualification in the sentence. All right, so the defining relative clause gives information which is necessary for the sentence, for the sense in the sentence, right? So we cannot omit this part of the sentence, this clause, so that the sentence is still making sense. We cannot omit this part of the sentence after that or which or who without a change in the meaning. This way, this is key information here. All right, defining relative clauses also describe an important quality. As I've already mentioned, Van Gogh was an artist who used a lot of bold, vibrant colors. If we omit this relative clause, who used a lot of bold, vibrant colors, Van Gogh was an artist. This sentence does not make sense to us in its full meaning, right? So we cannot omit this part. All right, non-defining relative clauses are clauses that give extra information about a noun, but the main clause will still make sense without it, right? So the mean I was speaking about in the beginning of my presentation. Napoleon Bonaparte was France's greatest military leader, right? So here is our basic sentence. Which extra information would we love to add here? He was born in Corsica, all right? So Napoleon Bonaparte, who was born in Corsica, was France's greatest military leader, right? So this part of the sentence is not necessary. We can omit this without any changes in the meaning. You can follow my intonation while reading such sentences with non-defining relative clauses, and judging by the intonation in the oral speech, you can say whether the information that the person is giving to you is necessary or unnecessary. All right, moving on to the next one. We can also use non-defining relative clauses to show consecutive actions, right? The consequences of some actions. Pesky passed the ball to Owen, who scored a magnificent goal, right? Some consecutive actions here. Also, some key information to remember about non-defining relative clauses. We always use a relative pronoun here. Which, who, whose, whom. And we never use a relative pronoun that in these cases, right? So always use a relative pronoun, but for that. Last year's winner presented the cup, which each holder keeps for the year. We did use relative pronoun and it was not that, right? So you can have a look at the incorrect sentences, but I will not pronounce them all. This offer, which will not be replaced, must end next week, right? So we use the relative pronoun which, and it is not the relative pronoun that. All right, let us move on. Also, how do we define between a defining and non-defining relative clause? When I personally start thinking about commas in the sentence, I ask a question whether this information is essential or not, whether I can omit this information or not. The natives who traded the settlers retained the land. Which natives retained the land? Is this information key about the natives? Probably those particular natives who traded with the settlers. Probably some of them did not do that and therefore lost their land, right? So this is the qualification of only those natives. But which natives retained the land in the second case? all the natives, because if we omit who traded with the settlers, the sentence will still make sense. The natives retained their land, right? So the scheme that we discussed at the beginning of my presentation. So there is also an option of making comment clauses so that we can add a non-defining clause to the end of the sentence to make a comment about the whole information, about information in the whole main clause, not just the noun in the main clause. Winston Churchill lost the 1945 election, which was rather unexpected, right? So here I marked that we refer to the whole information in the main clause, and the second clause, the subordinate clause, is dependent on the whole information in this main clause, which was rather unexpected. This way, we always use a comma after the main clause, and we always use the word which, not who, whose, whom, but the word which, because we refer to the whole meaning of the previous sentence. All right, so this was pretty it for relative clauses. I suggest that you right now have a look at these two sentences and you describe in the comments below probably what's the difference between these two sentences, right? You may probably create some context around the first sentence and the second one so that other viewers of this video also understand this grammar rule better. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you during my next explanations. Bye bye.